Thank you very much, and thank you to all who put this conference together. I've received many thanks in organizing it, which were kind of somewhat misplaced. The Philip Kennedy and the Institute, Gilles and Nils and Micah, and everybody who put it together deserve some credit. It is with great relief and pleasure that I welcome Suzanne Akbari here. Our lecture ended with a workshop. A director asked Dominique Julien, who is a co-organizer of this conference, to beat me up if necessary under this scenario that I was supposed to play a man who might have owed her some money. So thank you, Dominique, for not following your prompt. Suzanne Akbari is a professor of medieval studies and of English at the University of Toronto. Her education was at Columbia and in Johns Hopkins. I would like to give you a sense of some of her books, which combine academic erudition and topics which would be, I think, of interest to people beyond the academy. Seeing Through the Veil, Optical Theory and Medieval Allegory. Idols in the East, European Representations of Islam and the Orient, 1100 to 1450. That's from Cornell University Press, 2009, has just come out in paperback. She's an editor of Marco Polo and the Encounter of East and West, Toronto, 2008. And she's also a volume editor of the revised 4th edition of the Norton Anthology of World Literature. And this is just coming out now in February of 2012. Tonight's lecture will focus on how Christian medieval writers and readers understood and explained the differences they saw between themselves and Muslims, and how these medieval conceptions inform modern depictions and stereotypes of Muslims, Islam, and the Orient. Please join me in welcoming Suzanne Akbari.
Thank you very much, Paolo, for that kind introduction. And I'd like to begin by thanking both Paolo and Philip Kennedy for inviting me to give this lecture and for hosting such a wonderful and stimulating conference on world literature and translation. And I'd like to just use closing speaker prerogative to ask the workshop participants to give them a round of applause. I'm very grateful to have had the chance to visit NYU Abu Dhabi and to get a sense of what the community of teachers and learners is accomplishing here. And I'd like to preface my talk by saying a couple of words about how this topic, Western views of Islam, might relate to the themes of our workshop on world literature and translation. It's necessary in approaching the sometimes idealizing field of world literature to be mindful of what Mads Thompson earlier today called the power lines that lay behind the text that we read and translate. Helena Buescu put this extremely well earlier today when she said, concerning the intertwined history of Portugal and its former colonies, she said, "It's not always a happy history, but that history is there, and the worst thing that we can do is not look at it." And I think she put that extremely well. And in the spirit of refusing not to look at that unhappy past, I offer this paper as a kind of a backdrop or a context for our World Literature Conference. And my title is Empty Idols and a False Prophet, European Representations of Islam in the Era of Crusade. It's often assumed that from the 12th to the 15th centuries, there were two fundamentally different ways that European Christians viewed Islam. On the one hand, a series of war poems, or chansons de geste, and romances showed Muslims as polytheistic idolaters. On the other, Latin and vernacular biographies of Muhammad chronicled the prophet's life in detail, illustrating his career as a trickster, deceiver, pseudo-prophet, and representative of the power of Antichrist. Modern readers have tended to distinguish sharply between these two modes of representation. In his influential study of Western views of Islam in the Middle Ages, Richard Southern suggested that Christian attitudes toward Islam had undergone a kind of ascent or evolution, with progress from an age of ignorance to an age of enlightenment, moving from a simple lack of real knowledge to a more generous understanding of religious differences. In a series of important books on Western attitudes toward Islam, Norman Daniel reinforced this binary, both in the divergent areas of focus in his published books, but also in several explicit statements. In his Heroes and Saracens, Daniel focused exclusively on what he called popular ideas of Islam, as seen in the chansons de geste, or war poetry. On the other hand, in his Islam and the West, he focused on what medieval historians and clergy had to say about Muslims and Islamic culture. This binary opposition has continued to structure subsequent work on this topic, as can be seen even in John Toland's recent masterful book on medieval views of Saracens. Toll entitles one chapter, Saracens as Pagans, and another chapter, Muhammad, Heresiarch. One might agree with Norman Daniel that it is worth separating learned discourse from popular literature, written texts from those composed primarily for oral enjoyment, Latin texts from those expressed in the vernacular. Yet this distinction breaks down almost immediately, as can be seen in Daniel's own use of Latin historical chronicles as sources and analogues for the chansons de geste he describes. He's of course absolutely right to juxtapose these texts, but I would argue that he's wrong to claim, as he does repeatedly, that the treatment of Islam in the chansons de geste and related texts is, quote, wholly distinct from that of the academic and journalistic attitudes, end quote, that he finds in more explicitly historical or theological texts. Daniel argues that these are, quote, two entirely separate conventions within which the medievals express themselves. He states that these two traditions differ not only in their different circumstances of composition, but in the nature of their reception. While the learned texts were used in order to construct persuasive theological counter-arguments based on a relatively accurate representation of Islam, says Daniel, the chansons de geste, he says, are simply entertaining. When he speaks of the depiction of Muslims as polytheistic idolaters and the elaborate descriptions of their many gods or idols, Daniel goes on to say, it's hard to see that these are intended other than as fun. Without addressing the question of how we are to understand what Daniel calls the fun of the chansons de geste, I'd like to illustrate the extraordinary overlap in the two traditions that Daniel took such pains to separate from one another. At times, Daniel signals his own awareness of how hard it is to maintain such a rigid distinction. He notes that, quote, the audiences must have overlapped a little. He even acknowledges the likelihood that a single person might embrace both ideas simultaneously. It is always possible, says Daniel, for a man to hold mutually exclusive views simultaneously or to repeat mutually exclusive views without giving both or either credence, end quote. I would argue that it's not simply possible for one person to have two different ideas concerning Islam and Muslims. It is, on the contrary, desirable because those two conventions are mutually reinforcing and nourish one another. I'll begin by offering a view of what Norman Daniel calls the fanciful or fun mode of representation, that is, the depiction of Muslims as polytheistic idolaters, dedicated to a collection of gods, usually three, including Tervagant, Apollo, and Muhammad. I'll then discuss what Daniel calls the realistic mode of representation, focusing particularly on the polemical Western biographies of the Prophet Muhammad. In doing so, however, I'll emphasize the extent to which the language of idolatry permeates both of these modes of representation. Finally, I'll point out some of the ways in which sacred spaces, their sanctification and desecration, are central to the discourse of religious alterity that underlies Western Christian understandings of Islam, and which even, in a more subtle form, persists even today. The so-called fanciful mode of representation figures prominently in the chansons de geste, or poems of war, where Muslims are characterized as fierce idolaters who appeal to a wide range of deities and who finally, when their gods prove to be powerless against Christian might, turn upon their images and destroy them. Perhaps the best known example of this sort of iconoclasm is found in the Song of Roland, where the Muslims, disappointed by the weakness of their king, Marsili, run out and smash the images of those gods that both he and they have served. And here I'm quoting from the Song of Roland. They run to an idol of Apollo in a crypt. They rail at it, they abuse it in vile fashion. O evil God, why do you cover us with such shame? Then they tear away the idol's scepter and its crown. They tie it by the hands to a column. They topple it to the ground at their feet. They beat it and smash it to pieces with big sticks. In this passage from the Song of Roland, the powerlessness of the gods is illustrated not once but twice, as the gods first fail to bring about a military victory for their followers, and then, secondly, prove to be unable to resist the attacks made upon them by their own former worshippers. Comparable scenes appear in many, many chansons de geste. For example, in one of the 13th century epic poems dedicated to the Christian warrior hero William of Orange, the Enfance Guillaume, it's called, the pagan army led by Thibaut marches out bearing at its head a great image of Mahon, or Muhammad, covered with a green canopy and surrounded by many glowing lamps. Outraged by this sight, the Christians attack. And this is a quotation from the Enfance Guillaume. They launch their lances and throw sharp stakes, round rocks and great rough stones. Even before the pagans were aware, Muhammad already had 100 wounds or more. The neck is shattered, and the feet and the trunk. They kill him who is in front of the body, and Muhammad is struck down onto the ground. Again, as in the Song of Roland, such scenes dramatically illustrate both the practice of idolatry and the powerlessness of the gods revered in the act of worship. In addition, here in the William of Orange poem, the luxurious exoticism of the image is also emphasized, as it appears in the beginning of the scene covered with a rich canopy, surrounded by lanterns set with gemstones, which exude, quote, a light that shines like the sun, end quote. Such a characterization seems at first sight dramatically different from that found in historical chronicles and theological writings about the rise of Islam, which focus on the life of Muhammad and stress his advocacy and practice of deviant behaviors, his eloquent powers of persuasion, his ability to work apparent miracles by ingenious means, and his disgraceful death. Western biographies of the Prophet appeared in many forms, ranging from the short summaries found in the Golden Legend of Jacques de Voragine and the Historical Mirror of Vincent of Beauvais, ranging all the way to the full-length treatments found in the 11th century Life of Muhammad by Embricot of Mainz, the 12th century Otia de Mahomet by Gautier de Compiègne, and its 13th century adaptation in the Romance of Muhammad by Alexandre Dupont. In spite of their brevity, or perhaps because of it, the short accounts in the Golden Legend and in the Historical Mirror were among the most widely distributed and the best known. The longer accounts, however, are worth examining for the intricacy with which they develop an image of the Prophet designed to taint any real knowledge of Islamic theology. These texts tell of a pseudo-prophet who represents himself as being what he is not. He is an antichrist in two senses. First, in that he represents himself as a Messiah, and is therefore an inadequate copy or simulacrum of the real Savior of humanity. Second, in that he represents a manifestation of the Antichrist, that is, the enemy of humanity whose coming was foretold in the book of Revelation. The 11th century Life of Muhammad differs from the 12th and 13th century biographies by Gautier de Compiègne and Alexandre Dupont in certain respects, most notably in featuring a kind of bifurcated Muhammad. The figure of the Prophet appears as two characters in this work. The first one, a devious, manipulative magician, and the second, an upstart slave who, due to a successful marriage, rises to power. It resembles those later texts, however, in its focus on the licentious and deceptive nature of its subject. In the Romance of Muhammad, for example, the Prophet's love of sensuous pleasures is evident not only in his own personal behavior, but in the behavior he recommends to his followers. Not content with ordaining, quote, that each man should have 10 wives, end quote, he further commands that each woman should have 10 husbands. This notion is so scandalous for Dupont that he mentions it twice. This licentious behavior is just one feature, in the Romance of Muhammad, of a broader deviance, one that manifests itself not only physically in unorthodox behaviors such as polygamy and polyandry, but also spiritually, in the practice of a form of worship that proves to be idolatrous. It centers not on a pantheon of images as in the war poetry of the chansons de geste, but on a single figure, that of Muhammad. Yet this supposedly realistic mode of depicting Islam, as Norman Daniel calls it, is just as unrelenting as the obviously fanciful chansons de geste in characterizing Islam in terms of idolatry. In spite of their apparent differences, these two modes, the realistic and the fanciful, overlap in startling ways. While the chansons de geste lack any detailed account of Islamic theology or practice, they preserve from the biographical tradition the central role of Muhammad, not just in the presence of Mahum, or Muhammad, as one of the members of that pagan pantheon, but also in the standard name for any pagan image, that is Mahum, Mahomet, or Mahon. I mean, that's just the word for idol in these European vernaculars. Biographical texts such as the Life of Muhammad and Guibert of Nogent's Deeds of God performed by the Franks, or Geste Dei per Francos, recount the disgraceful death of Muhammad, stating that he fell drunk into a ditch where his body was devoured by pigs and dogs. This scene is reflected in the act of iconoclasm recounted in the Song of Roland, where the image of Muhammad is thrown into a ditch where, quote, pigs and dogs bite and befoul him, end quote. The idol is anthropomorphized, even embodied by its identification with the Prophet himself, violating the apparently distinct separation of the two modes of representation of Muslims. Similar overlap can be found elsewhere. For example, the early 12th century Deeds of Tancred, or Geste Tancredi, by Raoul Dequin, includes a description of a monumental statue supposedly adored by the Muslims at Jerusalem, which Raoul identifies with a little shiver of recognition as, quote, the ancient Antichrist, Muhammad the depraved, Muhammad the pernicious. In these passages, the image appears both as a generic Mahomet or idol, and in some sense as Muhammad himself. They thus suggest that the relationship between the two traditions is sequential. In other words, they imply that as time passes, the depraved religion preached by the pseudo-prophet Muhammad degenerates into further acts of idolatry centered on a collection of stone gods that include Mahum or Muhammad among their number. But this interpretation obscures how strongly the two traditions mutually reinforce one another, and the extent to which, in both traditions, idolatry is seen as the focus of worship. Like its precursors, the 13th century Romance of Muhammad includes a scene in which Muhammad, apparently miraculously, causes a white bull to appear on a hillside bearing the Quran suspended between its horns. We learn earlier in the story that he has actually trained this white bull to come at his call since the time that it was a young calf. On one level, this scene illustrates the conventional role of Muhammad as trickster and pseudo-prophet. On another, however, it reflects the prototypical scene of idolatry carried out with the golden calf by the Israelites led through the desert by Moses. This biblical allusion to Exodus is reinforced in the text by a series of comparisons between the old law of Moses and the new law of Muhammad. By mounting the book of this new law, or loi nouvelle, between the horns of the apparently miraculous animal, the sacred scripture itself, which could be seen as a point of similarity and convergence between religions, is instead characterized in terms of idolatry, widening the gulf between Christian and Muslim by lining up the Muslim with the abjected Jew, and reinforcing the centrality of the image in the Western understanding of Islam. Idolatry is also the focus of attention in the closing pages of the Romance of Muhammad, where the death and entombment of the prophet is recounted. Like the magnificently adorned images of Muhammad seen in the Deeds of Tancred by Raoul Dequin, and in the William of Orange poem discussed earlier, the tomb of the prophet is said to be surrounded with, quote, a lamp of shining crystal made up of every stone of garnet or precious gem, end quote. Even more remarkable, however, is the position of the sarcophagus itself. It is said to hang, quote, in midair with no fixed support. In this view, the light cast by the lamps and precious stones surrounding the tomb is a parody or false simulacrum of the real illumination offered by the true God, just as the floating sarcophagus of the false Messiah parodies the ascent into heaven of the resurrected Christ. The tomb is suspended, apparently by a miracle. Actually, Dupont reveals, the tomb is made of metal and is held aloft by magnets embedded in the walls of the surrounding structure. This apparent miracle, once again, proves to be simply the product of human ingenuity. A similar scene appears in the epic Song of Antioch. Here, however, the form of Muhammad suspended in midair is not the entombed body, but an image made of metal. This is a quotation from the Song of Antioch. Muhammad was up in the air through the power of the magnet, and the pagans adored him and gave their praise to him. They offered gold and silver up to him, end quote. These scenes in the Romance of Muhammad and the Song of Antioch are fundamentally the same. The only difference is that in the former, pagans make offerings to the suspended body of Muhammad, and in the latter, they make offerings to the suspended image of Muhammad. In both cases, idolatry is at the heart of the Saracens' error. Their worship is misdirected, whether towards an ineffective idol or toward a false Messiah. The sensuous pleasures supposedly ordained by the prophet, too, prove to be merely another form of idolatry. The writer of the Romance of Muhammad states that the new law of Muhammad preaches not only polygamy, but also, quote, a return to fleshly circumcision, unquote. Turning from the circumcision of the heart, enjoined by the Apostle Paul, to the circumcision of the flesh, from the renunciation of the sensuous satisfaction, to the embrace of the pleasures of the body, from the unsullied worship of God to the deviant adoration of the image, this new faith could only offer damnation and death. Idolatry here is presented as a kind of pleasure of the senses, reaching only as far as the luxurious surface of the image. This notion of Islam as a fundamentally superficial religion is common in the literature of the medieval Christian West. Whether manifested in the convention of Muslims as polytheistic idolaters, or in the depiction of Muhammad as the heretical leader of a Christian schism, Islam is consistently described as a religion of surfaces. It is said to privilege the fleshly body above the eternal soul, the letter above the spirit, and the physical image above its referent. This insight regarding the pivotal role of space in the construction of the alterity or otherness of Muslims, that is, the Christian characterization of Islam as a religion of the outside, of the exterior, provides a valuable tool when we turn to a third separate aspect of medieval representations of Islam, that is, the depiction of Islam as a source of contamination or pollution, and the description of Muslims as filthy and abject. As we will see, the rhetoric of pollution, which appears with great frequency in Crusade preaching and chronicles, proves to be, once again, grounded in the symbolic system of idolatry. In a wide range of texts written in connection with the Crusades, the city of Jerusalem is described as being contaminated. Pope Urban's original sermon calling for a crusade to the Holy Land, delivered at the Council of Constance in 1095, survives in several different forms, recorded by different chroniclers. The chroniclers all agree, however, in their rendering of the language used to describe the current state of Jerusalem and the urgent need for intervention on the part of Western Christians. One chronicler writes that Urban declared that Jerusalem is, quote, possessed by unclean nations, the holy places are irreverently polluted with their filthiness, end quote. Another chronicler records Urban's statement that, quote, the sanctuary of God is everywhere profaned, and that Jerusalem has been reduced to the pollution of paganism, end quote. As Penny Cole has shown, the rhetoric of pollution was essential not only to the preaching of the First Crusade, but also to subsequent chronicles of the Crusade, and even the preaching of the Second and Third Crusades, later in the 12th century. Much more can be said, however, about the nature of that pollution as it is expressed in Western accounts, and about the language used to explain how the contamination might be wiped away, how the holy places might once again be made clean. Crusade chronicles and sermons often represent the pollution of Muslim presence in physical, corporeal terms. Muslims are characterized as filthy or unclean, likened to pigs and dogs, I'm quoting. Their bodily presence, whether alive or dead, was thought to be enough to pollute a sacred place. For example, the Council of Nogano of 1303 stated that a church could be, quote, polluted by the burial within it of those under interdict, heretics, schismatics, pagans, or Jews, end quote. Other texts specify that the filth produced by Muslims comes from bodily fluids, particularly blood. Blood, of course, is not necessarily unclean in itself for Christians. In the right place, as in the sacrifice of the Mass, it can even be viewed as sacred or precious. Yet, when it is out of place, blood can be seen as contaminating filth or pollution. As the cultural anthropologist Mary Douglas suggested over 40 years ago, pollution signals nothing more than the violation of boundaries. Dirt, as she elegantly put it, is precisely matter out of place. It is paradoxical but true that the same substances that can pollute the sacred places can also be employed to make them sacred. As Mary Douglas writes, to talk about a confused blending of the sacred and the unclean is outright nonsense. But, she says, it still remains true that religions often sacralize the very unclean things which have been rejected with abhorrence, end quote. This ability of blood both to consecrate and to desecrate is illustrated in two letters written by Bernard of Clairvaux in support of the unsuccessful Second Crusade. In these letters, Bernard describes the contemporary state of Jerusalem, emphasizing the sacred nature of the Holy Land and harshly condemning the contamination of the Muslims who, he says, pollute the sacred places. Bernard refers to the filth of the pagans and likens Muslims to pigs and dogs whose presence, he says, profanes the Holy of Holies, the place where the immaculate lamb was purpled with blood, end quote. What is remarkable in these letters is not only their harshness, but also their emphasis on the sanctity of place and on the relationship between holiness and cleanliness, profanation and filth. Bernard indicates clearly that blood has the power to make things holy as well as to pollute. After all, it is the shedding of the blood of the Lamb, as he puts it, that made the holy places sacred to begin with. Just as Jerusalem was made sacred through the shedding of blood, so it was polluted through the shedding of blood. This act of pollution is recorded in Robert of Rheims' version of Pope Urban's sermon at Clermont. Robert writes, "They destroy the altars, having defiled them with their uncleanness. They circumcise the Christians, and the blood of the circumcision they either spread out upon the altars or pour into the vases of the baptismal font." End quote. It is interesting to note that the same accusation of forced circumcision of Christians that was used here was used in the 13th century in England and France, not against Muslims, but against Jews, who were perceived as an enemy within Christendom allied with the Muslim enemy outside. In this passage, blood both sacralizes and profanes. Jerusalem is made holy by the sacrificial blood spilled at the crucifixion, often associated in Christian devotional literature with the drops of blood produced during the circumcision of the infant Jesus. Conversely, however, the blood of the Christians forcibly circumcised by the Muslims pollutes the sacred places. The consecrated wine, transubstantiated into the blood of Christ, is sacred and clean upon the altar, being in its rightful place. This other blood, however, could be seen only as filth. Since blood was believed to have the power both to consecrate and to desecrate, it is unsurprising that medieval Christians believed that Jerusalem could be made pure again only through the spilling of blood. This is made amply evident in the chronicles of the First Crusade, where the climax of the siege of Jerusalem is the slaughter of the Muslims who had taken sanctuary at the Temple of Solomon, that is, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. For example, Fulcher of Chartres writes, "Within this temple about 10,000 were beheaded. If you had been there, your feet would have been stained up to the ankles with the blood of the slain. What more should I tell?" End quote. Another chronicler, Raymond d'Aguillet, similarly relates what he calls wonderful sights. This is Raymond. Piles of heads, hands, and feet were to be seen in the streets of the city. It was necessary to pick one's way over the bodies of men and horses. But these were small matters compared with what happened at the Temple of Solomon. What happened there? Men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins. Indeed, it was a just and splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of the unbelievers, since it had suffered so long from their blasphemies. The city was filled with corpses and blood. End quote. In what appears to be an eyewitness account of the First Crusade, the anonymous chronicler of the Geste Francorum, or Deeds of the Franks, describes the scene at the Temple of Solomon, where, he says, "There was such a massacre that our men were wading up to their ankles in enemy blood." This chronicler goes on, however, to explain the motivations of the Christians who carried out the slaughter. He writes, "Our men entered the city, chasing the Saracens and killing them up to Solomon's temple, where they took refuge and fought hard against our men for the whole day, so that all the temple was streaming with their blood. On the roof of the Temple of Solomon were crowded great numbers of pagans of both sexes. After this, our men came rejoicing and weeping from excess of gladness to worship at the sepulchre of our Savior Jesus, and there they fulfilled their vows to him. Next morning they went cautiously up onto the temple roof and attacked the Saracens, both men and women, cutting off their heads with drawn swords." What, we might ask, could slaughter have to do with worship? The juxtaposition of slaughter and worship in this passage is significant. The phrase used to describe the Christians' act of worship, "rediderent ei capitali debitum," can be translated, "they fulfilled their vows to him." Literally, however, it means they paid him, that is, they paid Jesus, what they owed him. The chronicler seems to imply that this debt is paid both spiritually, through the act of worship, and physically, through the use of the sword. This notion of slaughter as a pious act is made explicit in Peter the Venerable's sermon in praise of the Holy Sepulchre. Referring to the violent acts in Jerusalem, Peter tells his audience, "With pious swords you cleanse this place, and habitation of heavenly purity from the defilements of the wicked." End quote. In Peter's account, the sword itself is described as pious. Similarly, physical violence is itself described as worship. As Odo of Deu puts it in his chronicle, the purpose of crusade is, quote, "to visit the Holy Sepulchre and wipe out our sins with the blood or the conversion of the infidels." End quote. The reconsecration of Jerusalem by the Crusaders involved more than the ritual cleansing of the Temple Mount with the blood of captive Muslims. It also entailed restoring sacred places to their former state, removing reminders of the pagan past and restoring the Christian treasures which had been hidden away. In his chronicle, Fulcher of Chartres describes how in the newly Christian Jerusalem, quote, "a small piece of the Lord's cross was found in a hidden place. From ancient times until now it had been concealed by religious men, and now, God being willing, it was revealed. This particle was first carried to the Lord's sepulchre and then to the temple, joyfully." End quote. This making visible of what had previously been hidden is echoed in Fulcher's account of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He emphasizes the circular structure of the church, an emblem of its spiritual perfection, and the hole cunningly built into its roof. Fulcher states that, quote, "through a wide opening which was skillfully devised by a wise architect, the sepulchre can always be seen from above." End quote. In other words, the emptiness of the tomb is always visible, always on display. For the Christian believer, the sight of the empty tomb is a testament to the miracle that took place there and a reminder of the heavenly assumption of the glorified body of Christ. It is a pointer to the divine, rather than an object of worship in itself. For paradoxically, what makes the sepulchre holy for Christians is not Christ's presence, but its absence, his bodily absence. This spot, often said to be, as in the Book of John Mandeville and other pilgrim itineraries, the geographical center of the world, thus marks the threshold between the human and the divine. I've discussed the depiction of Jerusalem in the Crusade accounts at some length because it's necessary, I think, to have a clear sense of the nature of Christian beliefs concerning the sacred space of the Holy Sepulchre in order to understand precisely what these writers meant when they described the Muslim presence in Jerusalem as pollution. Several Crusade accounts specify the precise nature of the pollution of Islam. They say that the Muslims practice idolatry. While this may seem a bizarre accusation to modern readers who are aware of the extreme iconoclasm of Islamic theology, medieval chroniclers repeatedly make this accusation. In this respect, they are quite similar to the romances and war poetry I discussed earlier, which also describe Islam in terms of idolatry. References to Muslim idolatry appear in many chronicle accounts, including both those written by people who appear to have been eyewitnesses to the Crusade and those based upon earlier eyewitness accounts. The most suggestive version appears in the Deeds of Tancred, written by Raoul de Caen during the early 12th century. As I mentioned earlier, Raoul recounts how Christians entering Jerusalem found a giant silver statue of the ancient Antichrist, Muhammad the Depraved, Muhammad the Pernicious. Like the preachers of the Crusades I described earlier, Raoul emphasizes the role of place or location in the contest between good and evil in the Holy Land. He states, "God's house is possessed by the inhabitant of the abyss. Pluto's slave parades as God in Solomon's house." End quote. Raoul seems to suggest that the discovery of this statue came as a shock to the Crusaders. At first, he writes, they were not even sure whether the statue was one of Christ or of Muhammad. Other Crusade texts, however, suggest that Muslim idolatry is not simply something that Christians discover to their surprise upon entering the holy places of Jerusalem. In his account of Pope Urban's sermon at Clermont, Baudry de Dole quotes the Pope as asking, "Why do we pass over the Temple of Solomon, or that of the Lord, in which the barbarous nations placed their idols contrary to law, both human and divine?" End quote. Urban's statement, made before the First Crusade, reveals that Muslim idolatry is precisely what the Crusaders anticipated they would find, or to put it another way, what they planned to discover. It's a little like weapons of mass destruction. The accusation of Muslim idolatry found in the Crusade documents I've described is reiterated over and over again in a variety of medieval texts, ranging from universal chronicles like the historical Mirror of Vincent of Beauvais and Ranulph Higdon's Polychronicon, to epic poems, romances, and drama. As we've seen, moreover, medieval romances and chansons de geste frequently feature a kind of pagan anti-trinity made up of Mohammed, Tervagan, and Apollo. In these texts, the presence of Muslim idolatry serves to emphasize the sanctity and the violation of sacred spaces. Predictably, the destruction of the idols worshipped by the Muslims is presented as the single most essential feature of the purification of those sacred spaces. For example, in the Old French St. Nicholas play written by Jean Baudel around 1200 on the eve of the Fourth Crusade, the Christian Trinity and the pagan anti-Trinity are explicitly set up in opposition to one another. Actually, the staging puts them on opposite sides of the circle. While the effectiveness of the simple wooden statue of St. Nicholas is contrasted to the powerlessness of the golden idol of Tervagant, housed in the Muslim king's Mahomari, or mosque. This house of pagan worship, like the city of Jerusalem as it was described in the Crusader chronicles and sermons, must be cleansed, the pollution of idolatry removed. This is exactly why the St. Nicholas play, like the Song of Roland, concludes with the physical destruction of the idol in the Mahomari, so that the Muslim holy place, like the Muslims themselves, can be made ready to accept Christianity. In this way, the cleansing of Jerusalem served as a model or a template for the cleansing of all polluted holy places in literary texts. A peculiar logic underlies the claim that Muslims are idolaters. Christians know that Muslims are idolaters, so the fact that no idols currently exist does not prove that Muslims are not idolaters, but is simply the consequence of the fact that the Christians have already utterly destroyed their idols during the conquest. To put it another way, the absence of proof is simply proof that the evidence was destroyed. The peculiar logic, as I say. It's therefore unsurprising that the Song of Roland concludes by recounting the erasure of any memory of Muslim presence in Saragossa. The Christians are ordered, quote, this is the Roland, to search the city, the synagogues, and the mosques. Holding iron hammers and axes, they smash the statues and all the idols. No sorcery or false cult will remain there. The belief in Muslim idolatry requires that the charge be unprovable. This is precisely why chroniclers including Fulcher of Chartres, Jacques de Vitry, and William of Malmesbury immediately follow their claims of Muslim idolatry with the remark that Christians were never allowed to see the idols. Fulcher, you can't make this up. Fulcher, for example, when he refers to the holy place of the Temple of Solomon, Al-Aqsa, cautions the reader that, quote, I say holy, although nothing divine was practiced there at the time when the Saracens exercised their form of idolatry in religious ritual. They never allowed a single Christian to enter, end quote. These kinds of justification reveal that the idols supposedly worshipped at Jerusalem were imagined rather than discovered. The chronicle accounts that report Muslim idolatry unsurprisingly vary with regard to precisely where the idol was said to be located. One says that the statue of Muhammad was in the Temple of Solomon, that is Al-Aqsa. Another places the idol in the Temple of the Lord, that is the Dome of the Rock or Mosque of Omar. The third says that there were images both in Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock. The instability of this charge is due to the fact that each of the chroniclers bases his account on Fulcher of Chartres' earlier statement that there was in Jerusalem, he says, quote, an idol in the name of Muhammad. A closer look at Fulcher's words, however, suggests that his statement is based not on his belief that there actually was a physical statue, a monumental statue, but rather on the Muslim veneration of the rock which gives its name to the Mosque of Omar, that is, the Dome of the Rock. Fulcher states that, he says, quote, since that rock disfigures the temple of the Lord, afterwards it was entirely covered and encased in marble. Its present position is under the altar where the priest performs the rituals. All the Saracens greatly revered this temple of the Lord. Here they made their prayers more gladly than elsewhere, although they wasted them, since they erected an idol in the name of Muhammad. They permitted no Christian to enter there, end quote. The rock concealed beneath slabs of marble represents a focus of Muslim devotion that could not be recognized as legitimate by the Christians entering Jerusalem. It could only be seen as a focus of wrongly directed worship, as an object that leads the supplicant away from and not towards God. That is, it could be seen only as idolatry. The reason for this, of course, is because the rock at Jerusalem stands in precisely the same liminal position as the Holy Sepulchre. It is also a kind of threshold. As the place where the prophet began his miraj, or miraculous night journey into the heavens, it, like the empty sepulchre, marks the threshold between the human and the divine. Clearly, the Muslim veneration of Jerusalem as the third holiest city in Islam was seen by Western Christians as nothing more than contaminating presumptuousness. But presumably their veneration of their own holy place at Mecca would be respected somewhat more. Yet Mecca too was seen as polluted and polluting, a focus of pagan worship. Like the holy places of Jerusalem, the Kaaba is described as a domus Dei, or house of God. But Vincent of Beauvais qualifies this term by calling it a domum Dei illicitam, that is, an unlawful house of God. He goes on to state that the circumambulation of the Kaaba at the time of the annual pilgrimage is done in honor of Venus. In his Polychronicon, Ranulph Higden confirms that Muhammad told his followers, quote, to worship Venus, and that's why Saracens hold Friday to be holy. Venus is there. In some ways, the rhetoric of pollution applied to the Kaaba is very like that applied to the sacred places of Jerusalem. Both are said to be tainted by idolatry, and in both cases, fantasies of an imaginary idol are based on the presence of a rock that marks the threshold between heaven and earth and serves as a pointer to the divine. In other ways, however, the rhetoric of pollution differs with respect to exactly how the idolatry in each place is characterized. The idolatry at Jerusalem is able to be assimilated by the Christian crusaders. Raoul Decan describes how the statue of Muhammad was torn to pieces and melted down so that, quote, the metal, when its shape is lost, is changed back from vile to precious, end quote. Raoul's account is echoed by the anonymous continuator of Thudibodus' chronicle, who elaborates on how the metal of the statue, when melted down, actually became currency or coins with which the crusaders, quote, clothed the naked, cared for the needy, armed the defenseless, and, most importantly, added to the numbers of the army, end quote. Similarly, in the last lines of the St. Nicholas play, the golden image of Tervagant is thrown down, and the newly converted pagan king fulfills his threat to melt down the image and divide the gold among his men. In each of these scenes, the idol found in the polluted sacred space proves to be an unexpected source of wealth. The idolatry at the Kaaba, however, is characterized quite differently, for it is not assimilable and cannot become currency to be appropriated by the West. Instead, it is repeatedly associated with sexuality, femininity, and blackness. As early as the beginning of the 9th century, polemics against Islam identified the Kaaba with the practice of idolatry in precisely this way. The final chapter of John of Damascus's De Heresibus, or Book of Heresies, discusses the status of Islam and refutes the charge leveled by Muslims that Christians, in venerating the images of saints, practice idolatry. John turns this charge back upon the Muslims themselves. He says, "Why then do you rub yourselves against that stone at your Kaaba and love that stone to the point of embracing it? It is said," he goes on, "that this stone is the head of Aphrodite before which they prostrate themselves. And to this day, the traces of the carving appear to those who stare at it intently." End quote. This 9th century Byzantine text is far removed from the late medieval Western European writings I've discussed today. Nonetheless, it too displays the relentless focus on idolatry that is fundamental to a very wide range of writings on Islam, not just in the Middle Ages, but in the present day as well. For example, I noticed a rather subtle example of this in an art historical study of the function of the mihrab in mosque architecture. And as you know, the mihrab is the pointer, an indentation in the wall that signals the direction of Mecca. The author of this study states that the mihrab actually represents the continued presence of Muhammad in every congregation. It is, he writes, quote, "a certain absence that suggests a presence," end quote. Here, the mediating function of the mihrab is converted into a kind of idolatry, with the prophet placed, so to speak, in the line of worship. A far less subtle example of modern imputations of idolatry to Islam appeared in the media about a decade ago, a little less than a decade ago. You may recall the comments of a senior military official in the US government, General Boykin, who in 2003 described his battles against a Muslim warlord in Somalia this way. He said, "I knew that my God was bigger than his God. I knew that my God was God and that his God was an idol." Seriously, this is like 8 years ago. As we've seen, the accusation that Islam is actually idolatry is fundamental to both strands in the depiction of Islam in the medieval West. Whether the so-called fanciful convention that Muslims are polytheistic idolaters, or the so-called realistic view that Muhammad was a Christian schismatic. Moreover, the rhetoric of pollution deployed in connection with the preaching and the history writing of the Crusades is similarly grounded on the accusation of idolatry. The holiness of the sacred spaces is based on their transcendence of the site itself. The absence of Christ's body is paradoxically visible proof of the presence of God. The right use of images in Christian worship is ideally intended to imitate this scene of absent presence. In worship, the image ought to, so to speak, disappear as it is replaced by the holy spiritual referent to which it alludes. All this, for the medieval Western Christian, was precisely what Islam was not. As the foolish followers of a false religion, Muslims were thought to adore the image rather than the referent, the black stone rather than the divine reality toward which it gestures. As we've seen, the realistic and the fanciful strands in the medieval depiction of Islam were far from being two entirely separate conventions, as Norman Daniel put it. On the contrary, these two views nourished and supported one another. A reader who doubted the truthfulness of the ludicrous depiction of Muslims as polytheistic idolaters in the chansons de geste needed only to look at the historical and sober biographical accounts of the life of the Prophet. Here, the medieval reader could be certain was the real truth. No matter what angle you viewed it from, whether it be paganism or heresy, Islam was always seen as idolatry. Why then, we might ask, have modern readers been so ready to regard these traditions as wholly distinct? In his analysis of modern scholarship on medieval depictions of Islam, David Blanks suggests that Norman Daniel's work, like Richard Southern's, suffers from a tendency, quote, to force viewpoints into pre-established categories, end quote. For Daniel, Blanks writes, the true value of gaining a better understanding of Islam is not simply to acquire knowledge, but to bring about religious conversion. To support this view, Blanks quotes Daniel's own words. Daniel writes, "Conversion may not follow, but it cannot possibly precede the day when prejudice and hatred on both sides have been dispelled." End quote. The breadth of Daniel's work is without any doubt breathtaking, but the desire he simultaneously maintained for a future that would be characterized not only by mutual understanding and theological exchange, but also, perhaps, conversion, exerts a subtle yet formative influence on his approach to the topic, and on the ways in which he treats certain key issues, such as idolatry. Daniel could afford to recognize the accusation of idolatry in the chansons de geste. He remained blind to it, however, in the biographical polemics, perhaps because they served as a kind of a model, even if a distorted one, for the new, clearer depiction of Islam and Muslims he wished to present. It is certainly time, as David Blank suggests, for a new overview of Western views of Islam. What vantage point we ought to choose for this new overview remains an open question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. This was, I mean, the points that you highlighted, purity, impurity, but especially in my understanding, or blood and its sort of dual significance. It's not that I'm having trouble with idolatry and the way, but it seems to me that if one reads, at least the critics of Said and the way when Orientalists in terms of art, for example, when you cast certain aspersions on the Middle East, on the Orient, when you impugn it with certain bad things, you're at the same time sort of critiquing your own culture, or rather and I'm not really sure how that works in terms of idolatry. Was there a kind of a suppressed anxiety in the homeland, in Christianity itself, with regard to idolatry? I hope that's clear enough.
No, thank you for that question. Yes, it's yes. The short answer is yes. You're absolutely right. There is an anxiety that's reflected often in these accusations of idolatry, particularly accusations of idolatry and polytheism. I mean, there's a tremendous irony, right, in Christians accusing Muslims of polytheism when the doctrine of the Trinity is the thing that opens itself up to that kind of critique, right? And similarly, it's absurd to accuse Muslims of idolatry when it's Christians who use images in worship. And the place you see this most clearly is in Byzantine theological writing in the wake of the iconoclastic controversy, because there are very explicitly arguments about the status of Islam relative to iconoclastic and iconophilic views. That interreligious dynamic is very much highlighted. There's a beautiful study of Byzantine psalters by Kathleen Corrigan that talks exactly about this issue, the ways in which Christians used Islam as a foil for their own debates concerning their own theological positions. And this is exactly the same thing that happens again in the Reformation. So in other words, whenever the status of images comes up, Islam becomes the preferred interlocutor, so to speak, for articulating positions and demonizing the other position, whether you're an iconoclast or an iconophile.
I'd like to suggest, and pose as a question as well, that isn't a lot of this kind of a misunderstanding of, or development of a stereotype based on the fact that we have a tendency to confuse segments of a culture with, well, to confuse certain segments of culture. So we can say if a local, in an area, say the Middle East, we have actually many different cultures. They happen to have all a similar religion, Islam, but to accuse, say an atrocity is committed in a certain area by a certain group of people, well, they were guilty of this atrocity, but then the outside world says, oh, well, it's Islam. You see, that's what the reason why this atrocity was committed was because this is a tenet of Islam. Is similar to the Germans in World War II. You say, well, all these atrocities were committed because the Germans were Nazis. Well, that's not the case. In fact, a lot of the crimes were very heinous because the perpetrators of the crime were not Nazis. They were regular Germans. And vice versa. It's not fair to accuse all Germans of being Nazis, because they weren't. Only 20% of the population was actually Nazi. So I think that is the crux of a lot of this misunderstanding and the stereotyping of people, is that we make these blanket assumptions about religion and not taking a real scientific anthropological view of a culture as being actually segments, being parts, and that there are groups of people within these widespread religions or whatever.
Right. Well, to bring this back to Western perspectives on Islam and perspectives on Muslims, you see exactly this kind of phenomenon in some of these medieval texts that will, at times, distinguish between different subcategories of what they call Saracens, that is their word for Muslims, different ethnic or national groups, right? But when they want to lump them together, religion is the category through which they're lumped together. And when they're lumped together in that way, there's an absolute umbrella, an absolute kind of homogeneity that's presumed, that unifies and makes that alterity, that otherness, kind of absolute. Again, this is the sort of phenomenon you see even in the I was going to say in the media, but it's more pernicious than that. There's a show on American TV right now called All American Muslim. Anybody know this show? It's a reality show. And one of the companies that had bought commercial time on it, Lowe's, withdrew their commercial time purchases under pressure from a certain interest group. And the objection to the show cannot be that it's propaganda, right? Because it's reality TV, right? The objection is that it doesn't show Muslims as what people want to see them as, that is, as terroristic, right? So this desire to totalize is, I think you could say, endemic, is what's the word? Not perpetual, but recurrent over time in different kinds of ways. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to have a clear understanding of this phenomenon in the medieval past. On the one hand, it's important because we want to have an accurate and full understanding of the past for itself, for its own sake. It's also extremely useful to have an understanding of the kinds of categories, the kinds of misrepresentations, the structures of thought that allowed this kind of misrepresentation, to understand how some of them have percolated far down in time, even to our own day, maybe.
I read a book about the Saint Francis of Assisi and the Sultan of Egypt. And I found it to be fascinating certainly in its context, because it was also in the context of a crusade. And there was a battle going on, and there was, atrocities on both sides that were being committed and being made. But of interest to me as well is the politics that was behind the subjugation of the treaties that took place and that emerged from that very, very interesting encounter between the Sultan and the saint, or later to become the saint, the friar at the time. Mm-hmm. Would you please comment maybe about the Paul Moses book? It's quite interesting. Maybe some other people would know about it.
Yeah, actually, I wondered if you were referring to John Toland's recent book. I think it's called St. Francis and the Sultan, but is this a different book that you were mentioning?
I just checked it on the internet. Paul Moses?
I don't know that one, but I...
I read that one. It's not John Toland. It's a different one.
Well, I'd like to see that one as well. Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, I've painted with a very broad brush here to give a sense of the sort of larger discursive categories. But in fact, there are many, many stories of encounter, sometimes violent encounter, sometimes more peaceful encounter, sometimes encounters in the form of exchange of scientific or philosophical or literary forms. And so there are all these many different ways to talk about the exchanges that took place during the period of Crusade. And they're all important. I mean, I feel as though I've given you just one little slice, one little part of the story. There are many other stories of encounter, but I feel like it's helpful to have a sense of the sort of totalizing, derogatory discourse that was there, that was always available for medieval European Christian writers, always on tap, so to speak, whenever they would write about Islam or the Orient. But there's much more one could say about that. Thank you.
You spoke about Dante. Could you speak about Dante and the use of the mirage, and also the good Muslim Salahuddin?
Yeah, gladly. Again, a whole other topic. I almost did Dante for today, but then I didn't. There's a great deal one could say about Dante's view of Islam. And when I teach a large I teach a large survey course on literature. I've taught for the past 2 years at the University of Toronto. And we read a wide range of books, from Homer to Goethe. And we read the Quran as our last work, excerpts from the Quran, and as our last work in the fall term. And in the spring, we begin with Dante. And when I begin with Dante, I begin with Canto 28 of the Inferno. which is where Muhammad and Ali both are depicted in the Inferno, deep in the Inferno, in Dante's vision of hell. And so I use this as a way of sort of bringing out, at the outset, Dante's extremely, to say extremely negative is an understatement, view of Islam. Extremely negative, but also extremely nuanced, because to put Ali in the Inferno as a schismatic means that Dante is still somehow understanding Islam as a form of Christianity. In other words, Ali can be culpable in this Christian hell only if Islam is somehow still inside, able to be violated by schism. And so it's a very nuanced, very subtle, negative but very subtle view of Islam. Elsewhere in the Inferno, elsewhere in Dante's Divine Comedy, we see further aspects of Dante's, I guess you could call it ambivalence or complex view of Islam. And nowhere is that more in evidence than in the structure of his Paradiso, which, as a number of scholars have argued, and I've written a little bit about this as well, it's very clear that Dante is drawing upon certain elements of the Mirage tradition in the ways in which he structures his paradise. So what does it mean to write a cosmology, to write a work that you know is your masterwork, the work that you know will live after you, where on the one hand, Islam is almost the most filthy and abased thing you can represent. And those of you who remember Canto 28 of the Inferno remember it's pretty filthy. I mean, literally, like pollution. But at the same time, it's the source of your transcendent vision of paradise. What does it mean to have this double view of Islam? And there's a great deal one could say about that.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I've never heard so much data in such short time, so well presented. It's amazing. I'm not an academic, I don't do research, but this is a subject matter that really interests me a lot. I just read The Battle for God. I don't know how rigorous that could be in an academic world, but it did open my eyes. But there is something about your presentation which continuously you talked about, and I don't really understand it, which is the idolatry aspect. Mm-hmm. When we consider that all the three religions, including the Jewish, are monolithic, was it just a propaganda thing, or was it really a belief that the majority of the scholars, of the very few in those days in medieval Europe, actually believe in this idolatry, which for me is an eye-opener? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's bizarre on the face of it. I'll never forget the first time I became aware of this is I was very early in my graduate studies, and I was reading the French St. Nicholas play that I mentioned today. And I knew something about Islamic theology, and so I'm reading, and they're describing these clearly what's supposed to be Muslims. Their place of worship is a Mahomery. You know, it's pretty clear that we're talking about some kind of view of Islam. And there's a sort of a kind of, like I said, an anti-trinity of idols that these pagans, these Muslims worship. And I thought to myself, where is that coming from? I was utterly puzzled. In other words, not simply that it was obviously wrong, but why? Why would you think that? I think there are a lot of things one can say about that. I think probably the most important thing we can say is that when European Christians talk about Islam in terms of idolatry, in terms of being a religion of surfaces, in terms of valuing the letter over the spirit, they're talking about themselves. I mean, in part, this is about demonizing people in another part of the world, but it's often about controlling one's own religious boundaries, one's own social boundaries, that is, constructing an idealized vision of kind of the Christian community. So there's a sense in which when medieval European Christians are writing about Islam, sometimes they're talking about that part of the world, but often they're talking about themselves. They're constructing a kind of mirror image. Whatever that is, the opposite of that is what we are. So if they're polytheistic idolaters, well, we must be monotheistic non-idolaters, right? That's the logic. I hate to call it logic, but that's the mechanism.
I enjoyed your lecture very much. Could you comment on the actual front lines of this battle? How much conversion was going on either side, from Christians to Muslims, from Muslims to Christians?
There are a number of ways of answering that. The places for which we have the best information, the most comprehensive data, are from medieval Spain. And there's been a lot of very good work done on conversion patterns through the Middle Ages relative to legal changes that were taking place that affected Muslims, but also affected Jews. And so there's a great deal of useful data on that. Turning to the literature, which is what I was focusing on for the most part, or is another dimension anyway, it's striking that while medieval European literature stages many, many, many scenes of conversion, it's a very popular scene, a very popular thing to stage, virtually always Muslims to Christians. The only example I can think of off the top of my head is in the book of John Mandeville, where he talks about how the Sultan offered to give him a really wonderful bride and lots of money if only he would take on his law. He says, but I did not want to. You know, so it's sort of, but he doesn't condemn it. You know, it's sort of dangled out there as a possibility, but then not taken up. And once in a while, you'll find a couple of references to the possibilities of Christian conversion, but it's not something that the literature wants to reflect. We have more information on that as we move into the early modern period, particularly in connection with captivity narratives and so on in the Mediterranean. So in the earlier period that I mostly work on, that is before 1450, there's much less information on that.